getting access to the portal and submitting via the portal. This will be our first round of training. We do plan another additional training that will go through more through some of the examples of transactions that we will be looking to see in February. So we will provide that invite sometime in January. So stay tuned. Our goal today is to provide an overview of the annual reporting process and serve as also provide an introduction to the template. Raisa Muhammad on the compliance team will provide an overview of the requirements, and Sue Chang will walk us through the template and highlight some of the key functions of the template. And throughout the call, we just want to flag, please feel free to send your questions through the chat or stop us if you have any particular questions. We will reserve some time at the end, but we just want to make sure. Again, just want to flag that this training is being recorded, so if you don't want to be a soundtrack, you can please go on mute. We appreciate that. Just as a reminder, the reporting window opened March 1st, and it will stay open until March 31st at 11:59 Eastern Time. We do encourage early submission. Our goal is to work to some of the data issues, because I think all of us have really adopted some best practices working together in the last couple of submissions. And if you have any questions on completed template, please reach out to us via the mailbox. We will also provide the one-on-one office hours we did in prior years, where you can schedule time for your jurisdiction-specific annual reporting question. And again, just as a reminder, this annual reporting window is covering data for January 1st, 2025 to December 31st, 2025. Again, I just want to ask if you don't mind going on mute, because you're definitely going to be a starting role in our compliance training video. Again, like I said, we'll reserve some time, but again, if you have any questions after the training, we can go through that. We can move on to the next slide, please. Okay, annual reports are required for jurisdictions that have an executed Annex A agreement, not Annex A, allocation agreement with Treasury before December 31st, 2025. So just remember that even if you don't have transactions and you have an allocation, your allocation agreement was signed by December 31st, 2025, you will have to acknowledge it in the portal. We will go through that. And there's more training about how you can make that acknowledgement. So no matter what, if you have an allocation agreement with Treasury as of this date, you will have to either submit transaction or acknowledge that you don't have transactions. So just keep it in that in mind. Just because you don't have a transaction doesn't mean you don't have to report. Our portal, the reporting portal, the same portal used for disbursement and quarterly, will open again on March 1st, and it will close on March 31st, 2026. The reporting portal will not accept any completed template before March 1st. So just keep that in mind, and it will not, if you submit late, you have to go through a whole process. So we will walk through that, but just make sure if there's any issues with the deadline, you request early extension. Because as you know, reporting is a part of your allocation agreement. And for jurisdictions that submitted last year, your new template will include a prior year data, and it will be on the loan and performance tab. We just ask you to review that. And overall, just review your template to ensure your program information is correct, especially for new jurisdictions. We will send out an email reminder once the window opens and throughout the process, just to make sure that you're reporting and following the deadline. I will stop there to see if anyone has any questions. Oh, we will just move to the next slide. So just as a reminder, the difference between annual and quarterly and disbursement is we're only collecting expanded transactions related to investments, loans, and expanded 171. So keep that in mind, please, as you prepare to submit your annual data. I will pause. Please jump in with your question, Shay.
Right. I'm sorry if I missed you saying this. When did you say our templates would be available?
I did not say that, and thank you for reminding me that to say that. The templates are actually available. We put them in the portal on Friday, so we just ask that you please look in the portal and make sure that information is correct. Yes, so your template, thank you for letting me go back to my talking points. Yes, your templates are currently available. We had it available a little early this year, so we know you can get started on your reports. Thank you for the great question. If you don't have any expanded transaction, like I said, you do have to acknowledge in Section 3 of the portal, and you will also have to certify. And so that's the whole process. Again, we have some videos on this process. And just as a reminder, if you have transactions that were not previously reported, if you were doing some self-audit and you identify certain transactions that were not reported in 2024, please go ahead and include them on this current report. And the screen print include this slide include the acknowledgement page. So that's a picture of the acknowledgement page. We can go to the next slide, please, Raisa. Just to mention, just like similar to the other templates that you use, really the disbursement templates, this templates will be divided in the CAP transaction, the loan credit transaction, and the VC tab. So please only enter expanded transactions in those tabs. Just again, to flag on the final tab of the annual reporting, you will have prior year data. You can update that, but any transaction you enter for current year will automatically populate on that tab, on the loan and performance tab, and loan and investment performance tab. I think that concludes my part of the presentation. Again, please put your questions in the chat. I'll turn over to Raisa, who will provide more detail on the annual report. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mayma. All right, hi, everybody. Hope everyone's doing well. All right, so let's get started with the annual reporting timeline. So for those of you who have joined us in previous trainings, specifically the disbursement training, this timeline is going to look pretty similar to that. So once jurisdictions submit their report, so they're going to download and complete their template. They will submit it in the portal, the same portal that you're going to be downloading the template. So that's going to be the certification and submission section. That's the second box here. And then after that's happening, then it's going to go into data validation. So what we're going to do is we're going to process your template through a series of validations to ensure that the submitted data is in line with our SSBCI program requirements, are also in line with our allowable data types and option sets. If there are any errors resulting from the data validation process, then they will need to be corrected prior to the final acceptance of the annual report by SSBCI. And you will know why, because at the end of this timeline. So as you can see, between the annual report submission and certification, there are those yellow arrows because sometimes those 2 points can loop back and forth. There, you're going to have to submit your template. We're going to run it through data validation. And if there's any errors, we are going to require you to correct those. And then you're going to have to resubmit until we have clean data. Next, from data validation, we're going to move into compliance verification and sampling. So this is where it varies from disbursement. In disbursement, all jurisdictions will be sampled, but for annual report, select jurisdiction will be sampled. So if your jurisdiction is selected for sampling, you will be notified. And lastly here, Treasury then publishes the annual report data on our website, which is kind of why we got to make sure the data is accurate, because this data will be published. So that's how the timeline for this is going to go. So let's jump into our first topic, which is the provider. So the first element on the annual report is going to be the provider. So the provider tab, you're going to find out when Sue does her demo, is going to list all of the providers. So we want to make sure that before you list the providers on the provider tab, we have the appropriate provider for each of your programs. So first, for loan programs, for loan participation, loan guarantee, collateral support programs, CAP programs, that provider should be the lender whose loan is supported by SSBCI funds. Specifically for companion loan programs, the provider is the lender whose loan is the source of private capital at risk in the transaction. For equity and VC programs, specifically direct investment programs, that provider is the implementing entity or contracted entity that invests SSBCI funds in a business. For fund investment programs, the provider is the fund that invests SSBCI funds and private capital in a business. So I want to also highlight for hybrid programs, if you have a hybrid program that is a funds hybrid program, it's going to follow this definition here for funds programs. And if you have a hybrid program that's a direct program, it's going to follow the definition under direct programs. All right, so as mentioned, the provider tab after the tooltips tab is going to be the very first tab you see on the annual report. So for jurisdictions with expended transactions completed completing the annual report for the very first time, you'll need to input that provider information on the Provider tab. If your jurisdiction reported in a previous year, that previous year provider information will be pre-populated for you on the Provider tab. So although this information is pre-populated for you, we want to clarify that that provider data can be edited on the template. So if you need to make any edits to the pre-populated provider data, you are more than welcome to do so, and the template will allow you to do so. Something else to call out for the Provider tab is that we require each provider to be linked to the program type associated with the transaction. So if the same provider is used for more than one program type, the jurisdiction should enter the provider on the Provider tab for as many programs as the provider has expended transactions. So for example, if ABC Bank has 3 expended transactions in 2025, one in your LPP program, one in your LGP program, and one in your CSP program, then ABC Bank should show up 3 times on your Provider tab connected to the 3 different programs. Okay, also on the Provider tab, for jurisdictions with VC funds programs, the target venture capital fund size should be reported on the Provider tab. So we want to clarify here that it is the target venture capital fund size. So please do not report the total fund size here. And also for VC funds that were previously listed with the target fund size from previous reporting, you can update, as I mentioned, this information. So please update that target fund size if the number has changed at all. And for reference, that target fund size should match the amount reported in column E on the funds notification form. All right, and rounding out our provider information on this slide, we have some links to assist you in providing accurate information on the Provider tab for your loan transactions. So this list is not comprehensive, but it should serve as a valuable resource for you when you're completing this data type, this data field. So as you complete it, just reference this list to make sure that you're using the correct provider information for your CDFIs, your credit unions, and your depository institutions. Also, when you're inputting the provider information, make sure you're using the full name for each provider. So this means no abbreviations, no shorthand, and do your best to not include any misspellings. We want to make sure that the provider regulatory ID and the provider name match as accurately as possible. All right, so we have a loan or investment transaction amount is going to be one of the important columns here, and it's going to be on all of the transaction tabs. So for loans, for caps, loan guarantees, collateral support transactions, the loan transaction amount is the private capital from the lender supported by the cap reserve account or SSBCI guarantee or collateral deposit. For loan participation program transactions, the loan transaction amount should be the private capital from the lender plus SSBCI funds. For equity programs, for both direct and funds programs, the investment transaction amount is going to be the private capital investment plus the other private co-investors, plus the SSBCI funds in the financing round. And I also want to make sure you make note at the bottom here that this loan or investment amount should not include borrower's equity, concurrent private financing, or additional government funds. All right, here, SSBCI allocated funds, as Mayma mentioned, and this is the hallmark of our annual report, it is only expended transactions. So for this annual report, we only want expended transactions and expended 171. So no obligations, no transfers, no admin expenses. So here, these SSBCI allocated funds definitions should be very straightforward, but please use this slide as a reference if you have any questions there. But I do want to call out for the loan guarantee program that the amount entered for SSBCI allocated funds should be the amount set aside to cover the guarantee amount for the commitment. So for example, if a jurisdiction is guaranteeing a loan or providing collateral support for 50% of a loan, however, it only set aside 10% of that 50%, then only the dollar amount of that 10% that was set aside should be reported under SSBCI funds, SSBCI allocated funds expended. So that was a little bit of a handful if you're new to this concept, but I'm going to go over it again in a couple of slides. All right, so we have SSBCI recycled funds. As we progress in the program, this is going to become more and more relevant for jurisdictions. So I want to highlight here the definition. SSBCI funds, SSBCI recycled funds should, 1, come to the jurisdiction in the form of program income, returned program services, repayment of principal or return of invested capital, and 2, it should be expended, obligated, or transferred by the jurisdiction into new loans or investments. So the recycled should meet this twofold requirement. Just receiving the funds back doesn't make it recycled. It should then be redeployed to make it recycled. So it should only be reported as recycled once they've been redeployed into new loans or investments. And if there is no redeployment, then it should not be reported as recycled funds. So how would you report recycled funds? So let's jump into an example here. So this is how to report a transaction that uses recycled funds. So a small business investee receives an SSBCI supported investment in which the jurisdiction provides $100,000 in SSBCI recycled dollars on a $200,000 investment. So one, we have $100,000 of private capital and $100,000 of SSBCI recycled funds. So on the annual report, that investment transaction amount should be $200,000, right? That's the private capital plus the recycled funds. The SSBCI recycled funds column should include $100,000. And the key here being under SSBCI allocated funds, it would be $0. So in this transaction that utilizes all recycled funds, you would not include any SSBCI allocated funds. All right, into our next concept, we have concurrent private financing. So concurrent private financing also should meet two requirements. First, it's financing that was caused by or resulted from the SSBCI supported loan or investment and occurred at or around the same time as the SSBCI supported loan or investment. So one, a small business receives an SSBCI supported working capital loan, and as a result of the SSBCI supported loan, the borrower receives an additional loan for equipment at the same time. That would be concurrent private financing. That being the additional loan would be considered concurrent private financing and should be reported as such. So what is not included as concurrent private financing should be any SSBCI funds. You shouldn't include any of the private financing that is included in the SSBCI supported transaction that you're using to meet your lender capital at risk requirement. That should not be reported as concurrent private financing. All right, so how to report concurrent private financing. So here's another example. A small business borrower receives a $200,000 loan from one lender supported by an SSBCI loan guarantee of $100,000 for working capital, where 20% or $40,000 of the loan guarantee was set aside. At the same time, the small business borrower receives a $50,000 loan from a different lender for equipment that was caused by or resulted from that SSBCI loan. So firstly, we have the $200,000 principal loan amount from the lender. Then number two, under SSBCI allocated funds, we have $40,000. So we have $40,000, although it's a $100,000 guarantee. Again, like I mentioned a few slides ago, it is only the set aside amount that you would report as SSBCI allocated funds. So in this example, the only amount that the jurisdiction would report as SSBCI allocated funds would be $40,000, the set aside amount, and the equipment loan for $50,000. So on the annual report, you would enter a $200,000 loan transaction amount, SSBCI allocated funds expended of $40,000, and concurrent private financing of $50,000, which is the equipment loan. All right. Next, we're jumping into subsequent private financing. So subsequent private financing is the total dollar amount of private financing received after closing of the loan or investment that is caused by or results from the initial SSBCI supported loan or investment. So here's how that would work. A small business receives an SSBCI supported loan. Then that loan strengthens the borrower's credit worthiness. The bank approves the borrower for an additional loan based on that approved credit, on that improved credit. So that means that the private financing received after the closing of the first loan is considered subsequent private financing. Okay, so let's see how that would be reported and where that would be reported on the annual report. So a small business receives a $20,000 SSBCI supported loan from a bank as part of the jurisdiction's LPP program. The total loan is $100,000. The loan strengthens the borrower's overall creditworthiness. As a result, at a later date, the bank approves the borrower for an additional $50,000 working capital loan. So here we have $80,000 of private capital, $20,000 of SSBCI allocated funds, and a $50,000 working capital loan. So on the annual report, the loan transaction amount would be 100,000, the SSBCI allocated funds plus the private capital. $20,000 of that is the SSBCI allocated funds, and that $50,000 working capital loan that was resulting from it at a later date would be reported as subsequent private financing. But here in the parens, you'll see it's going to be reported on the loan and performance tab. So that's going to be a different tab, which will auto-populate from your transaction tabs that Sue will go into later. But that $50,000 subsequent private financing should be reported on a different tab. All right, and into our last example here is additional government funds. So additional government funds is the dollar amount of other funding from other public or government sources participating in the SSBCI supported loan or investment transaction. So one, a small business receives an SSBCI supported loan, and as part of the same transaction, the borrower receives an additional loan from a government administered entity. That additional loan would be considered additional government funds. Okay, and our example for this one is a jurisdiction has a $50,000 SSBCI pro rata share in Fund A. Fund A invests $1 million into a business. In addition to the SSBCI supported fund, the investment round for the business includes $1 million from other investors, non-LPs, and an additional $100,000 from another jurisdiction. So the breakdown here is $500,000 Fund A matching private capital, $500,000 in SSBCI allocated funds, $100,000 in government funds, and $1 million in other private financing. So the total investment transaction amount for this would be number 1, 2, plus 4. So that would make it a $2 million investment amount. The SSBCI allocated funds expended would be $500,000, which is the SSBCI funds, and additional government funds would be $100,000. It would be reported separately in another column on that same tab. So that is all for me. I'm going to go ahead and pass it to Sue, who's going to go ahead and demonstrate all of this good stuff that we just learned on the template. Thank you.
Thank you, Raisa. I'm going to start sharing my screen here. Second. Okay. Raisa, can you tell me if you can see the Excel template?
Right. Yep, I can see it.
Okay. So I'm showing an example of the AR template on the screen. The AR template is customized for every participating jurisdiction, including jurisdiction-specific data. There are 8 tabs. 3 are informational tabs, and 5 tabs are for data entry. The first tab is the tooltips tab, which is the informational tab. The tooltips tab will detail every data element that's collected in the annual report. You can also read these tooltips by hovering over the column header for each of the columns on the transaction tab. The tooltips will contain the name of the data element, the tab location of the data element, the tooltip information, that is a description of how to report that data element, and the tool data type, how we expect you to report that data element. The last 2 tabs are also, let me cover this, are also informational tabs, the single select and the multi-select. Right? Okay. Here, for every data element that has an option set, you will see the allowable option. As an example, for the form of business organization, here are your allowable responses. So you will see these options directly within the template, either in a drop-down list for a single select response or when using the multi-select functionality. You can also use these 2 tabs to copy and paste if you're completing your data that way, or you can use these 2 tabs as a reference information if you have a system where you're entering and collecting all of your data. Okay, so in addition to these informational tabs, we have the 5 tabs for reporting. And the first one is a provider tab, where you report your provider information. Let's go for a walk. As you can see, this tab currently contains data. If you report in the prior year, you'll find that your prior provider information will pre-populate here in the provider tab. If you need to update any of the provider information, you need to update the EIN, the regulatory ID or provider type, you may make that update directly here. For jurisdictions with VC fund programs, we've also pre-populated target fund size from your 2024 annual report. Please review and ensure these amounts are still accurate. If you need to make any corrections, you can make that update directly on the template. So to add new providers for your 2025 providers, you'll start by selecting which program the providers is participating in. Right here, you'll see the first custom drop-down option. Every jurisdiction will have a custom list of your approved programs, and this will be coming from your application or your agreement modification to have this, and this will be customized for your jurisdiction. Okay, so for my example, I'm going to have a provider that's participating in the equity funds program. Okay. And right, so you can see that populated there in column B will be populated based on that approved program with SSBCI. Okay, so if the name of your program or your program type is incorrect, please reach out to us. We can have that corrected for you before you submit your annual report. Okay, the next column is the provider name. This is a free text entry, but make sure you're entering the correct entity as a provider, which should be the legal name of the provider. Please refrain from using acronyms, abbreviations, and ensure that there's consistency across transactions. Okay, so I'm gonna put in here, just on 1B as the provider. The next column is the provider EIN. Should be 9-digit. Please review to make sure please review your EIN numbers carefully, particularly if you're copying and pasting. It can be 2-digit followed by 7, or just all 9 digits here. So I'm gonna do 2. Okay. And column E is your provider regulatory ID. If you hover over the top of the column name or go back to the tooltips tab, you'll see that there are several options for what type of ID you can provide. Enter the ID most applicable for this provider. If you have a provider that's not on the list, you can type in other, or if this provider does not have a regulatory ID, you can also type in none. However, if you type in if it's other, it will be prompted for you to type in the next column, as I'm going to show you here. Okay, right. This is conditional formatting that you'll see throughout the annual report. You can then enter the other provider name in the next column, right? So whatever that is, provider ID. Okay. Alrighty. Okay. Alrighty. Column G is the provider type. You can select from the drop-down list of allowable options. And again, you can also select other. So there's other, and which will flag for you to enter something here. So in this case, this is a venture capital fund. So this other provider the yellow highlight will go away. Okay. Target fund size, the next column. As I mentioned earlier, this is the size of the supported VC fund, including the SSBCI Capital and all private capital raised that the jurisdiction identifies available to invest alongside SSBCI. As a reminder, we are looking for the target fund size and not the total fund size here. And the total target fund size amount should match what you reported in column E of your fund notification form that you submit to us. So here, the target fund size is 5 million. Okay. The last column on the provider tab is also relevant to jurisdictions with VC fund programs. Here, you will want to enter the amount of allocated funds expanded for cost to program services to portfolio companies, or as we call it, 171. Okay, so here, 171 expense for 2025 for this fund was 8,000. Okay, so that's all on the provider tab. So you continue to fill out all your providers for all your programs here. Okay, so I'm going to move to the next tab, which is the CAP transaction. That is the Capital Access Program transaction. For the purpose of this presentation, we're going to cover the loan credit transaction example, as it's the most common program type in SSBCI. So we'll circle back to the CAP tab a little bit later. But if you do not have a CAP program, then you can leave this tab entirely blank. So you just basically skip over it. Same goes for the other program type that your jurisdiction does not have. Okay, so I'm going to move to the loan credit OCSB transaction tab. I'm going to go through a complete example from beginning to end for a loan participation program transaction. Okay. The first column that you enter is the unique ID for this transaction. For the unique ID, you decide what that looks like for your jurisdiction. There's no prescribed formula of how to come up with the unique ID, but it should be unique for every single transaction. It could be alpha or numeric or combination of those, and it can include a dash, underscore, or pound sign. Just make sure there's no trailing space. Trailing spaces. For example, this is a unique ID for this transaction. My unique ID is just unique ID 123, and I'm going to go ahead and include the trailing space so you can see what that looks like. So but don't enter it with that trailing space. It will cause an error when it flows to the loan performance tab. So make sure to not include the extra space. So I'm going to so 1, 2, 3. Okay. Alrighty. Okay. I'm going to go to the next column, provider. Column B, which is the provider. You'll select the name of the provider from your drop-down list that you enter from the provider tab. If you haven't entered the provider for the transaction in the provider tab, you're not going to see it in this provider drop-down list, right? So we recommend first to enter all the providers that's participating in all your and all the programs that then come to this transaction tab, so you can see those options here. Okay. So for this transaction, the provider for this transaction is Community Bank. All right. In column C, you will select the approved program name. You should see the name of each of your approved program based on your allocation or your mod agreements. Right. If you don't have a program type that's compatible with this tab, this list will be blank for you. That's another also helpful indication to you to make sure you're entering the transaction information in the correct tab. This tab is an LPP program type. And then in column D, program type, as you can see, it will automatically populate based on the approved program agreement with SSBCI. Okay. Column E is actually new for this year annual reporting, but it's not new to jurisdictions that have recently completed disbursement request. Right? For loan participation program transaction, here you will select from the drop-down whether this transaction is a companion loan or a purchase participation transaction. Okay, for this example, this is a purchase participation loan type. Okay, now for the next few columns, you will enter specific information for the borrower. So I'm going to start entering some information on the business name, EIN, address, etc. So the business name for this is Asthma Corporation. Business EIN must be a 9-digit. If a business is owned by an individual and does not have a 9-digit business EIN, you may enter a text. So this one I have 5, 7. If I enter too many, for example, like it will flag there's an error, right? So you want to pay attention to that. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So it's 9 total here. But if it's a business that's owned by an individual and only has an SSN, and you can enter like SSN like this, and you should be good. Okay, so I'm going to put an address 1. The next is the city name here. Okay. For the business state, we have a drop-down list of all the state codes here. Select the one that's applicable for where the business is located. The business state will be used to determine this is in or out of jurisdiction transaction. You're allowed to have 10% of your transaction outside the jurisdiction. We will use the business state to basically determine that, right? Okay, so this one, I'm going to put DC and the zip code. Okay. Zip code, just enter the 5-digit. You do not need to enter any numbers after that. Okay. Next is the NAICS code, which should be a 6-digit NAICS code coming from the 2022 list. We've included a link in the tooltips tab to that list. It should be the 6-digit should be specific and not just a high-level industry identification. For example, I'm going to type in just specific, and I think I type in too many. Well, will give you, it'll tell you that it exceeds a 6-character and length. So I'm going to escape out of that, and then okay. The next 2 columns is the year of business open. And then this is a form of business organization. Is also a drop-down selection. So you make your selections applicable for this transaction. And you can obviously select other as well. But you have to put in the other type of business receiving that funds. Okay, so I'm going to go back to some corporation. The highlight should go away. Alrighty. The next column, tribal government type. This will be hidden in all state and territory templates as it is not applicable. So if you see a hidden column, there's a reason for that. You can ignore that. Okay, it will be hidden. You won't see it. Okay. Alrighty. Primary purpose. The primary purpose, it is a drop-down option, so you can select from the allowable responses here. Okay. So I'm going to, and there's also selection for other, which will require you to enter other in the next column. But this one was to purchase an existing building. So I do not need to enter anything on the next column already. Column S is a secondary purpose of the loan. This is an optional column, so it can be left blank if there's no secondary purpose. It is a multi-selected option though. So to interact with the multi-select options, what you want to do is double click on this cell that will pull up this pop-up where you can select the multiple responses. So I'm going to do that now. Okay. I'm going to select 3. Okay. Okay. As you can see, it will automatically populate your responses in a semicolon separated list within the cell. However, note that the last selection does not have a semicolon. So the last one does not need to have the semicolon in there. Actually, we don't want you to have it included in there, otherwise it will cause validation issues. Okay, as a reminder, any transaction that's refinance transaction, right? You should put the refinance as under the secondary purpose, and you should indicate the primary purpose under the primary purpose of the loan. So, for example, right, you want to include as a refinance of outstanding debt if you have a transaction that you're for any refinancing, but you have to include the primary purpose of the loan's underlying purpose that's being refinanced. Okay. I'm going to move on to next 2 column, climate aligned and climate impacted communities. Jurisdiction should obtain this information if available from borrowers receiving the SSBCI funds. Lenders should ensure there's appropriate documentation to support the responses, and you should apply it consistently. Beyond the definition in the guidance, we do not have, Treasury does not have further definitions regarding these 2 data elements. For this sample transaction, it's yes with this, no for climate, and then yes with the climate impact communities. Okay, and column W, disbursement date. As Marisa mentioned and also Mehmet, like for annual reporting, you're reporting only expansion transactions, right? So for the disbursement date, you will enter the date the funds were dispersed. Okay. So in this case, I'm just gonna put in 1/1/2025. Right. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next two columns, loan transaction and SSBCI allocated expanded. This transaction example is a purchase participation loan. In a purchase participation, jurisdiction use SSBCI funds to purchase a portion of the loan originated by the lender. In this case, in this example, this jurisdiction used 50% of the total loan from community bank. So the total loan in this example is 100,000. And since the jurisdiction purchased 50% of that total loan, 50,000 will go in the SSBCI allocated column. Okay, we're going to review the SSBCI allocated amount to the loan transaction amount to check for private capital at risk, right? As a reminder, for this transaction and all remaining loan credit transactions that we covered today, the lender must bear 20% or more of the risk of loss in any transaction, right? If the lender capital is not at least 20%, it will be flagged for further review in the data validation stage. Okay. Moving on to recycle funds. For recycle funds, as Raisa explained earlier, recycle funds is a case where the funds have been returned or returned as a result of principal repayment or return of invested capital that have been redeployed. Recycle fund can also come from program income. If the funds are coming from your recycled dollars, you enter the use of recycled money in the SSBCI allocate in the recycled funds column and not in the SSBCI allocated column. So example, for this example, let's say that the funds is coming from your recycled dollars, you would leave this blank or and 0, right? And then you report the 50,000 in the recycled column, like that. Okay, in this case, in our example, it all came from the SSBCI allocated column. So, okay, the next two columns, additional government funds and concurrent private financing. As Raisa discussed earlier, any portion of the transaction that fits description for additional government funds or concurrent private financing, be sure to incorporate that information here, right? In our example, the additional government funds was 0. You can enter 0. You can just leave it blank. But for this transaction, this provider had a $20,000 of current private financing coming from their in the form of borrower's equity. Okay, I'm gonna go to next few columns. Before I move on, I just wanted to note that recycle funds and concurrent private financing and as well as subsequent private financing all counts toward your 10-to-1. So if you have the information, you want to enter those information on the annual report. Okay, moving on to column C, we're going to enter the business revenue. Right, this is a drop-down menu where you can just select from a range of instead of actual dollar amount. So just put the range in here, right? Okay, so I'm gonna move on to FTE, full-time equivalent employees, right? You can read the description by hovering over the column. But just as a reminder, FTE below 10 qualifies for this action. FTE just want to reiterate that we do not want to duplicate FTE count. So for example, if there are 2 transactions going to the same small business, but for different business purpose, what you want to do is enter 8 here for this. And then let's say then the next funding, the total FTE is now 10. What you want to do is report the 8, and then the next transaction would be 2 for a total of 10, right? So just want to show that to you. Okay. Column A, E, and AF is jobs created and jobs retained. These data elements do not require calculation metric like FTE, but it is based on a head count from full-time, part-time, or temporary jobs. You can find the definition from the tooltips here. Okay. Alrighty, I'm going to move on to the next few columns on loan information. Okay. Scroll a second here so you can already. The loan type, right? This is a drop-down selection. So select the loan type for this. For this transaction. The selection that you make here will influence some of the required input for the remaining columns. So, for example, let's say this loan type is revenue-based loan. This will trigger and require input on other repayment term here, right? However, for this example, it's a line of credit, so that now this other repayment term goes away, right? And same thing with other, if that you select other than other loan type is a required entry there. Okay, so go back to loan credit. Okay, loan term would be in just number of months. In our example, 60. Next comes APR. We just enter the APR rate. Okay. For maximum interest rate, you will want to enter the maximum interest rate per the loan agreement. If none is stated, you may enter 18%, which is the maximum NCUA rate. Right. So this transaction, the maximum interest rate on the loan agreement is 10%. Okay. For the interest rate at the time of obligation, this is just simply the actual interest rate at the time of obligation. In our example, it's also 10%. The next comes interest rate variability. This is a drop-down selection. Here you would indicate if the rate is fixed, adjustable, or both. In this example, it's a fixed interest rate. Okay, so we're going to skip other payment because it's only revenue based. Okay, other upfront fees. All right, so for upfront fees, you should include all fees that's paid by the borrower, such as application fees, origination fees. It shouldn't include any guarantee fees paid to the state. And you can get more information from the guidance and the guidelines as well, but we also include in this and the tooltips as well. Okay. All right, and for this transaction, the upfront fees was $1,000. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next 4 columns, are SETI categories, which you should be familiar with. For column AP, self-sort based on demographic business status. This is a multi-select option. You can view the options by just double-clicking on it. And I'm just going to select first 3, just to show you. Here you go. Okay, and the remaining 3 SETI sort is just single select. So, okay, oops. Okay. Okay. And so we're done with the SETI sort, and the rest, starting with minority-owned control, all the way to the end, which is on veteran status. Right. These are those last few columns are demographic information related to principal owner or owners. Generally, principal owner is defined as a natural person who owns directly or indirectly 25% or more of the equity of the business. The business may have multiple principal owners. For those that have multiple, you can make your selection based on by just double clicking, right? The race of principal owner, for example, you can have to say okay. And then there are single select options, right? So I'm just going to go through these quickly. Again, this is also dealt with multi-select. So you just have to finish complete all the rest of these. These are all demographic data. So Okay, this one. So here now we're completed our loan credit transaction tab. Alrighty. So now I'm gonna circle back to the cap transaction tab. Okay. The cap transaction is almost identical to the loan credit transaction, right? With the exception of these two columns I'm going to show you, borrower insurance and lender insurance premium. Zoom in a little bit so you can see that. Okay, alrighty. These two columns are specific to cap transaction. The borrower and lender contribution must be within 2 to 7%, and the combined total should match the SSBCI amount. They do not have to be equal amount, but they must match the SSBCI amount. For example, this transaction loan amount is $10,000. And SSBCI contribution to the cap reserve account was 700, which is 7%, right? So the maximum that the borrower and in the borrower and lender premium column, the combined percent must be 7%. So in this column, you have 5% here, and then you have 2% here. If I enter 3, it will tell you that you've exceeded that range. Okay, so okay. So that's really it. The rest is the same as the loan credit transaction tab. All right, so I'm going to move to the next tab, the VC equity OCSP transaction. Okay, this tab is also very similar to the other transaction tab that we've covered. However, for expanded VC fund and direct equity transaction, there are additional data elements that are unique to equity transactions, and I'm going to cover these columns that are unique to equity transactions, starting with column A, AF, source of private capital, if not the provider. Okay, for this column, it's going to be only available as a drop down when you're entering a direct equity transaction, right? You can see this is a direct equity transaction because it's provider type direct equity, right? It's not going to be available if you're entering a fund transaction. So this would be grayed out, right? So and then this one, with this transaction, I'm going to enter the source of private capital. It's a growth equity fund. Okay, moving on to the next column, stage investment. Again, make your selection most appropriate for this transaction. Okay, right. Okay, moving on to next column. I'm going to zoom in slightly, and this is kind of small. Sorry. Okay, security type. The selection here will have other implications. So depending on what your security type you select, you may be required to answer different data element. So for example, let's say the security type is preferred stock. You'll see that the ownership percentage now column A will require you to have it to input in this column. Okay, but let's say your security type is a safe agreement. Right now, you have to input your information related to conversion discount, valuation cap, and type of cap. So here you would enter like 10%, for example, with valuation cap 10 million for this transaction, and then you have to indicate if it's pre or post money. That's and then I think there's any more. Oh yeah, I think I missed one here. Incubation early stage options, right? So this, for example, the response for this was yes. Okay. All right, and then the rest is really the same data elements is the credit tab that I just covered. Alrighty, there's one more tab that will require you to have to input. Okay. Right, I mentioned this in the early in this presentation. This section, this tab will contain all your pre-populated unique ID, business name, and EIN if you submitted prior annual report data. So we'll contain all these, and you just have to enter any subsequent prior financing, funds loss, or equity gains for 2025 for these transactions. And then for your new transaction that you enter in this year, right, that you enter in the CAP tab, credit, or equity tab, right, the unique ID, business name, and EIN will carry over to this loan investment performance tab. For these business, likewise, report any subsequent prior financing, funds loss, or equity investment gain. If you don't have any to report, you may leave this blank. And also, it's like I said earlier, it's helpful to for jurisdiction to input any subsequent prior financing to help your jurisdiction reach that 10-to-1 goal. So this concludes the demonstration of the annual report template. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to the SSBCI inbox. And thank you for paying attention. Thank you. That's all I have. I'll turn it over. I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to you, Raisa.
Thank you, Sue.
All right, thank you, Sue. Couldn't find my unmute button. All right, so we're not quite done yet. Bear with us. We just have a few more slides left, and hopefully they're going to be really important for you guys as you're completing your templates. Okay, so we have some tips that we want to make sure you guys are keeping in mind. So this slide, as well as a couple of the next slides, just use as a resource for you as you're filling out the template. So first is eligible business purpose. So SSBCI supported loans and investment proceeds must be for an eligible business purpose, and that information can be found in our guidelines. So that's the primary question that you should be answering in any deal. That's the primary compliance question that you should be concerned with for each of these transactions. Next, we have the NAICS code. So make sure you're inputting a NAICS code. It should not be left blank. And make sure it's a 6-digit NAICS code from the 2022 NAICS code list. And that link to those that list can be found here on this slide. Then for business EIN, if you are using the borrower or investee's social security number, we ask that you do not provide the full social security number and just input SSN into that field. Okay, also for EIN numbers, something that we've seen in the past is the use of duplicate EIN numbers. So just be sure to review your EIN numbers, particularly if you're copy and pasting, to ensure that the same EIN number is not applied to different businesses. And lastly here for the disbursement date, these are all expended transactions. So for the disbursement date, we're going to be looking for the date that the funds were dispersed to the borrower. And also, since this is our 2025 annual report, we're also going to be making sure that the disbursement date falls within the calendar year of 2025. And this, of course, excludes transactions that were not reported, as Mayma mentioned earlier in the presentation. If you have transactions that you didn't report on a previous annual report that are now expended, please do add those, even if it is a different disbursement date year. Okay. Next, upfront fees. Sue has already gone over this, so I'll just quickly go over that it should exclude fees that are paid to the program, and it also should not include cap premiums in these upfront fees or charges. For FTEs, if you're reporting for the same business with multiple transactions, only report the incremental change in the FTEs on the subsequent transaction. So if there's no difference in FTEs, just enter 0, but do not leave this field blank. Okay, so for business revenue, we're not asking you to input the exact number of the business revenue for these businesses. Rather, it's a drop-down menu with a range for business revenue. So just be sure to use that drop-down menu and select from the range options. For transactions with multiple co-borrowers, make sure that you are reporting the co-borrower or business that is primarily benefiting from the transaction and just apply that consistently. And Sue did mention this as well for refinancing transactions. Refinancing is not a primary business purpose. You should include the primary purpose for the loan that is being refinanced. Refinance can only be input as a secondary business purpose. Right. Now we have borrower and lender insurance premium caps. So the federal contribution cannot be used to match any amount in excess of the sum of the borrower and financial institution lender contributions. So for maximum interest rate for variable interest rate loans that do not indicate a specific maximum interest rate, but instead state that the interest rate will not exceed the legal allowable rate. Report either the legal allowable rate for the jurisdiction or the SSBCI maximum allowable rate at the time of obligation, whichever of the two is lower. Okay, for our investment programs, capital providers can approve investment amounts, an investment amount that is dispersed in tranches, provided that there's adequate private capital at each closing and all other eligibility requirements are met. So for the interest rate at the time of obligation, report the actual interest rate at the time of obligation. So in some cases, this might be the maximum rate, but that's not going to be what we see typically. And at the end of each of the transaction tabs, you'll also see some of the SETI and demographic related fields. Just be aware that these are multi-select fields. So just double click into the field and your options will appear and you can select from the multi-select there. All right, so now let's get into some tips on the actual template. So the first template tip we have is just ensure that you're filling out all of the required fields. If you're entering a value of other, just ensure that the other descriptive field is also filled out. You can't just leave other for most of these columns. You'll have another column that will ask you to provide some information. For example, for provider type, if you put other, then this next column will ask you to type in a value for other provider type. All right, generally we do ask you to refrain from pasting into cells. This is just to help avoid formatting and errors, issues that come along with pasting sometimes. Next, I want to highlight some of the ways that the template functions that Sue has shown as well. If a cell is highlighted in yellow, that means a previous cell you have populated requires further explanation. So you're prompted to populate that cell highlighted in yellow. And if the cell is highlighted in red, that means you're violating the data validations for that cell. And that's typically based on a previous cell or a previous column. So just make sure that when you have red highlighted cell or yellow highlighted cell, if you need to remove that, let's say you've deleted the information in that cell, you need to remove that, you can right click on the cell and select clear contents, and that should remove the highlight. All right, so let's keep going with this. The unique transaction ID, as Sue mentioned, it's going to flow, each of the transactions are going to flow to the loan investment performance tab. So make sure there's no space at the end of your unique transaction ID because that will affect how it moves over to the loan investment performance tab. So just make sure there's no space at the end or anything additional, any additional characters at the end of the, any additional spacing at the end of your unique transaction ID. And this can also help you if you're not able to find your transaction on the loan and performance investment tab. Sometimes it didn't pull over to that tab because of a trailing space. So if you don't see it there, the first place you should look is back to the unique ID and just see if there's any extra space at the end. All right, we also want to make sure that you're saving your template in a secure folder, prevents it from opening in protected view. If you open it in protected view, it's going to disable our macro features. So one of our suggestions that we've seen work pretty smoothly in the past is that if you have access to OneDrive, if you download the template in OneDrive and then open the template from there, you'll be able to easily open up and utilize all enable contents and all the macros will function properly. So if you have OneDrive, we think it's a best practice to just open it up in OneDrive, and that should help some of the issues that some jurisdictions experienced in previous years. All right, and just please don't leave any rows blank in it if you can, and also don't try to alter the template in any way. If you have any questions or need to make changes to the template, just always reach out via the inbox and we're happy to help you. Okay, so as Sue mentioned earlier, also we have multi-select versus single select. So please utilize those two additional tabs on the annual report that will specify for you whether these data fields are single select or whether they're multi-select. We just want to make sure that you're not manually inputting information into these fields that have a drop down that maybe you're not aware of or a multi-select double click that you're not aware of. So just be sure to just cross-reference what you're inputting with the single select or multi-select fields and just make sure that you're using it how it should be. Because like I mentioned way at the beginning of the presentation, the timeline, if there are data issues, it can kind of cause this loop where you'd have to fix those and resubmit the annual report. So just as much as we can limit that, that would be easier on both of us. So just make sure that you're aware of what options are available for each of those cells rather than trying to override and manually enter any information. All right, and lastly, for entering multiple values in the same cell, make sure that each of the values is separated by a semicolon. So while each of the values should be separated by a semicolon, we ask that you do not have a semicolon at the end, because then the system is going to be looking for that additional value. So just make sure here you're not having a semicolon at the end, and it just ends without the semicolon, as you can see in this first example. Okay, and so for the template macros, it's going to be a banner at the top once you open up your template, and you're going to click Enable Content. So once you enable the content, all of your in-template validations and option sets should work appropriately. So if you're having any technical issues, we first have here a resource for you on this slide, how to enable macros. That's really helpful step-by-step guide. If you're not able to enable the templates using that guide, we suggest that you reach out to your IT department, make sure that they don't have any, there's any signatures required or something that might be preventing the macros from being enabled on your annual report template. So that should be your next stop. And then if you continue to have issues, including with your IT department, then feel free to reach out to us at the inbox, and we'll try to sort out what's going on with your template. But this link here is going to be a helpful resource for jurisdictions opening up their template if you have any macro issues. All right, and that is all for me. I'm going to pass it back to Mayma.
Thank you, Raisa. Thank you, Sue. Appreciate the presentation. Thanks everyone for staying with us. I know it's been it's a long one, but we hope you find this information useful. Just want to point you guys to our resources that we discussed. Like Sue said, everything she went over in a template is included in our reporting guidance. If you need additional information or any additional definition, that's all in there. And again, it's all included on that first tab of the template. You can reference that throughout your as you complete the template. If you have any questions, please let us know. Like I mentioned, we will have this recording available in the portal, but we already have several recordings available. We will always also leverage our VC SMEs, the office hours, with the equity and the lending office hours to maybe preview how to complete transactions as we get closer to the reporting window and throughout the reporting window. So hopefully you'll find that information useful. And again, if like Raisa just said, if you have any questions, you need time with us on the reporting or other compliance matter, please send it to our mailbox. We will be happy to help you resolve anything that you may have. We will have another part of this training, which will be mostly going through some of the details, the best practices, and some things that we'll adapt from last year. Like Raisa said, you really drive the timeline. So if you can start completing those early, making sure any error reports, that error you see in the template, you address that early, making sure you're following all the tips that Sue gave you. If you have a business that have more than one transaction, do not duplicate FTE. Make sure you follow all the appropriate data length that's also available in the other templates, additional templates that the compliance team have made available. I will stop there. We do have our SMEs on the call as well. If you have any questions, they're here to support. Well, please jump in and let us know if you have any questions. Again, the template is available in the portal, and please download and walk through that and make sure all your data is clean and it's reflected in any modification that you may have already had. Because sometimes we may, we're all humans, so we may have missed something, but we did our best. So hopefully you can check on us on that. That's all I have. So I'll open the floor up. If you are sick of hearing from us and you want to just send us a question, we can also conclude the training. But thank you so much for your time. And we look forward to working with you till March 31st and 3 months, I'm sure, after that. Hopefully not 3 months. Thank you. Thank you, Sue. Thank you, Raisa. Thank you, Grace, for recording. Okay, If we don't have any questions, I see people dropping. I would thank everyone for your support and your time, and we will end the call. We'll see you at the next round. Thank you. Bye. Thank you all.